To the world she was a nobody, the quiet governess in a house of immense power. But in one shocking moment, a dead duke's final command would make her the most powerful woman in London. On one condition, she must marry a man who despised her very existence. Could a woman with nothing to her name tame the heart of a scorned heir and save a legacy from ruin? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The day the old Duke's will was to be read, a funereal quietness settled over Cavendish Manor, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound. In the grand library, where the air hung heavy with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and the cloying sweetness of dying flowers, London's elite had gathered like a flock of elegant vultures. They were dressed in expensive mourning black, the rustle of their silk and satin, a counterpoint to the low murmur of avaricious gossip. Sunlight, thin and pale as a watercolor wash, streamed through the tall velvet-curtained windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, each a tiny, glittering speck in the oppressive atmosphere. Miss Clara Everly stood near one of these windows, a solitary figure in a modest grey gown that seemed to blend into the shadows of the towering bookshelves. Her face, usually a mask of calm composure, was pale, and her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles showed white. She was a ghost in this room of vibrant, greedy life, an observer positioned just far enough from the main group to be almost invisible, which was precisely how they treated her. Her grief was a private, sharp thing, a stark contrast to the performative sorrow on display. She mourned not a title or a fortune, but a man, her employer, the reclusive Duke Henry Cavendish, whose quiet wisdom and strange, lingering sadness had been her daily companions. She thought of his final days, the tremor in his hand as he pointed out a constellation in a beloved astronomy text, the way his voice would trail off whenever he spoke of his estranged son, a wound in his heart that had never truly healed. Across the room, Lord Harrington, the late Duke's cousin, held court. He was a man whose ambition was poorly concealed beneath a veneer of aristocratic charm. He stood near the solicitor's table, his chest puffed out, already acting as if he were the master of the house. He spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry, outlining his grand plans for the estate. A new wing here, a different crop rotation there. His sister, Lady Beatrice, fanned herself with a languid, dismissive air, her eyes darting about the room, finding fault with the slightly faded tapestries and casting a particularly pointed, disdainful glance toward the silent governess in the corner. "So much dust," she sighed to a companion, her voice a sharp whisper. "The place has been utterly neglected." Clara's gaze drifted over them, her expression unreadable. She saw the glint of greed in Harrington's eyes, the petty cruelty in Beatrice's smirk, and felt a wave of protective anger on the late Duke's behalf. They saw only a building, an inheritance, a collection of assets. They had never seen the man who sat in this very library late at night, his mind soaring among the stars while his body failed him. They did not know the secret kindnesses, the anonymous donations to scientific societies, the deep well of loneliness he had concealed from the world, but not from her. An oppressive silence finally fell, thick and expectant, as the family solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, stood. He was a man of dry precision, his face a roadmap of solemn duty. He held the Duke's last will and testament in his thin hands, as if it were a sacred text. Harrington's smug smirk widened. He shifted his weight, ready to accept the mantle of power he had so long coveted. "Mr." Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He began to read, his voice a monotone drone that methodically outlined a series of minor bequests. A distant cousin in the north received a modest annuity. A loyal stablemaster was granted a small cottage for life. With each minor clause, the tension in the room coiled tighter. The small talk had ceased entirely, replaced by the sound of strained breathing. Harrington's smirk never wavered. He was a coiled spring, ready to leap into his new life. Then, Mr. Abernathy reached the main clause. He paused, looking up from the document for a single, significant moment, his gaze sweeping over the hungry faces before him. "And now," he announced, his voice gaining a new, resonant authority, "we come to the matter of the Dukedom of Cavendish, its associated titles, properties, and the entirety of the Cavendish fortune." A collective indrawn breath. Harrington straightened his waistcoat. "I, Henry Arthur Cavendish." "Mr." Abernathy read, his voice clear and unwavering, "Being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the whole of my estate, without exception, to Miss Clara Everly." The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a deep well. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned, absolute silence. Then, chaos erupted. A collective gasp gave way to a cacophony of outrage. Lady Beatrice let out a small, strangled shriek. Lord Harrington's face, a moment before so smug, contorted, the colour draining from it before returning in a tide of purple rage. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "A trick! The man was senile, he was not in his right mind. She manipulated him, the conniving little viper. The governess," someone whispered in disbelief. "He left it all to the governess?" Mr. Abernathy raised a hand, his expression unmoved by the pandemonium. "There is a condition," he stated, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The room fell silent once more, every eye now fixed on Clara, who stood frozen by the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. The solicitor continued, his voice firm. "Miss Everly shall inherit everything, provided she agrees to marry my estranged son and rightful heir, Lord Nathaniel Cavendish. Should either party, Miss Everly or Lord Nathaniel, refuse this union, the entire fortune, the title, and all properties shall be immediately transferred to the Royal Society for the Advancement of Science, and the Cavendish title shall become extinct." The second bombshell was more devastating than the first. Lady Beatrice laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. Marry Nathaniel, that disgraced rogue? The gambler who fled to the continent with his tail between his legs? This is the ultimate insult. The Duke was of sound mind, and his instructions are unequivocal, Mr. Abernathy repeated, his gaze locking with Harrington's furious stare. "The choice rests with Miss Everly and Lord Nathaniel." Just as the renewed wave of chaos threatened to crest, the great library doors swung open with a resounding crash. Framed in the doorway, as if summoned by the very mention of his name, stood Lord Nathaniel Cavendish. He was impossibly handsome, with a lean, restless energy that seemed to fill the room. His dark hair was artfully dishevelled, and his clothes, though stylishly cut, were travel, worn, and creased. His eyes, a deep, stormy blue, surveyed the scene of apoplectic relatives and the stunned governess with a mixture of raw contempt and weary resignation. He had been summoned by Abernathy hours ago, and had clearly arrived just in time to witness the spectacular fallout of his father's final, mad pronouncement. Clara felt a jolt, a physical shock, as if lightning had struck the room. She had only ever seen portraits of him, stiff and formal. In person, his presence was overwhelming, a whirlwind of bitterness and barely concealed pain. The weight of the late Duke's last, desperate wish settled upon her shoulders like a physical shroud. This was the man her kind, gentle employer had mourned. This was the source of his deepest sorrow. Nathaniel's gaze swept past the greedy, sputtering faces of his relatives, dismissing them as if they were nothing more than irritating insects. His eyes landed on Clara. He saw a plain, unremarkable woman in a drab grey dress, her face pale with shock. In his mind, the pieces clicked into a grim, cynical picture. This was not a plan for reconciliation. This was his father's ultimate revenge, a cruel, posthumous joke designed to chain him to the very life, the very duty, he had fled. He pushed himself off the doorframe and sauntered into the room, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so cold it could freeze fire, "this is a charming welcome. Am I late for the party, or just in time for the punchline?" His stormy eyes fixed on Clara, pinning her in place. "So you're the one," he drawled, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "The governess who inherited a dukedom. Tell me, was it your piety or your pity that bewitched him?" The room held its breath, waiting for the little grey mouse to squeak. But Clara met his scornful gaze directly. Her own voice, when it came, was quiet, but as steady and unyielding as granite. "It was my loyalty, my lord," she said, her chin held high. "I was his friend." Her words, spoken with such simple, unadorned conviction, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the avarice and hysteria that had preceded them. For a fleeting moment, Nathaniel's cynical mask faltered. He saw not a schemer, but a woman whose grief was as quiet and profound as his father's study. Then the mask was back in place, the scorn returning to his eyes. Friendship, he thought bitterly, was just another currency in this house. Hours later, the vultures had departed, leaving behind a trail of muttered threats and simmering resentment. In the Duke's private study, the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. A decanter of brandy sat on the mahogany desk between Clara and Nathaniel, catching the dim lamplight like a trapped star. He had not sat down. Instead, he paced the room like a caged tiger, his restless energy a palpable force that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The room smelled of his father, of old leather and pipe tobacco, and the scent was a fresh torment. "A friend," he finally sneered, stopping his pacing to glare at her. How touching. And what did this friendship entail? Soothing his brow, reading him poetry, or whispering poison into his ear about his own son? He leaned his hands on the desk, his face a mask of fury. "This is a trap, and you are the bait. My father, in his infinite manipulative wisdom, has found a way to leash me from beyond the grave, and he is using you to do it." Clara sat with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate him further. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture erect. She refused to be baited, refused to let his raw anger chip away at her composure. "Your father loved you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This was not a trap. I believe it was a desperate, perhaps misguided, attempt to bring you home, to force you to claim the life you ran from." "The life I ran from?" he laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I ran from suffocating duty and a father who saw me not as a son, but as a successor. And what has he done? He has shackled me to that same duty, and to you." The cruelty of his words was a physical blow, but Clara absorbed it. She had to. The Duke's last wish depended on it. Faced with the alternative, the complete and utter loss of his family's legacy to a charity, Nathaniel knew he was cornered. The title, the lands, the name, it was all he had left of a family he both loved and loathed. He straightened up, his face hardening into a cold, businesslike mask. "Very well," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "We will do this. We will marry. But let us be perfectly, unequivocally clear. I am doing this for the name, not for you. This will be a marriage in title only. You will have your money, you will have the name, but you will not have me. We will be strangers living under the same roof. You will be a quiet, invisible duchess, and I will continue to live my life as I see fit. Is that understood?" Clara looked at the deep, profound pain beneath his anger, the anguish of a son who felt utterly betrayed, and her heart ached for him and for the Duke who had failed to reach him. "I understand your bitterness, my lord," she replied, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of his emotion. "I ask for nothing from you but the civility required to maintain this estate as your father would have wished. The dukedom is your birthright. I am merely its temporary guardian." Her answer seemed to disarm him. He had expected tears, arguments, perhaps even a plea. Her calm acceptance of his harsh terms left him with nothing to fight against. He felt trapped, resentful, and profoundly alone, seeing in her calm face the final, successful machination of his father. For Clara, a profound sense of isolation settled over her, but with it, a flicker of iron resolve. She would honor the Duke's wish. She would be the guardian of his legacy, even if it meant being married to a man who despised her. The following days were a blur of stiff, impersonal arrangements. The trip to procure a wedding ring was an exercise in frigid courtesy. They rode in a carriage to a high-end London jeweler, the silence between them as thick and unyielding as a wall of ice. The shop was a hushed, exclusive world of velvet and glittering diamonds, where patrons spoke in whispers and appraised each other with sharp, judgmental eyes. Nathaniel was recognized instantly, and the whispers that followed them were like the rustle of dry leaves, gossiping about the great Lord Cavendish and his shockingly plain Governess bride. Nathaniel treated the entire affair with a detached impatience that bordered on contempt. "Show us your simplest bands," he instructed the obsequious jeweler. "The most unadorned. This is a matter of function, not sentiment." The jeweler, sensing the frost in the air, produced a tray of plain gold rings. As Nathaniel examined them with a critical eye, Clara's gaze was drawn to a different tray, one the jeweler had set aside. On it was a beautiful, intricate ring, a delicate band of woven gold, and nestled within the design was a small, hidden sapphire. So deep a blue it reminded her instantly of the late Duke's kind, intelligent eyes. When the jeweler, hoping to tempt them, presented a gaudy diamond cluster, Nathaniel scoffed dismissively. Before he could make a choice, Clara spoke, her voice quiet but clear. She pointed to the sapphire ring. "That one, please." Nathaniel's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with momentary surprise. It was the first decision she had made that was not entirely passive, the first time she had asserted a preference. He looked from her determined face to the delicate, unusual ring. It was not what he would have chosen. It was not simple or plain. It was unique and elegant, and held a secret. He gave a curt nod to the jeweler. "As the lady wishes," he said, his voice flat. He bought it without another word, but the choice, her choice, lingered in his mind. It was a small act, but it was an act of will, a hint of a person more complex than the meek governess he had decided she was. The cold, heavy feel of the gold in his pocket was a constant reminder of the unwelcome bond that now tied them together. Their first public appearance as an engaged couple was at a grand ball hosted by the Marquis of Ashworth. The ballroom was a dazzling sea of glittering jewels, rustling silks, and the collective weight of 1,000 critical eyes. The moment they were announced, a wave of whispers rippled through the crowd, following them like a malevolent shadow. Clara, in a simple but elegant dark blue gown that had been hastily procured, felt the stares like tiny, sharp needles. She kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Nathaniel's arm, the contact purely for show, yet it sent a strange, nervous tremor through her. Across the room, they saw Lord Harrington and Lady Beatrice holding court, their expressions venomous. They were spreading their poison, painting Clara as a manipulative shrew and Nathaniel as a fool. As if drawn by their gaze, Lady Beatrice detached herself from her circle of sycophants and glided toward them, her smile as sweet and deadly as arsenic. "Lord Nathaniel," she cooed, her eyes flicking over Clara with open disdain. "How brave of you to attend, and Miss Everly." She paused for effect, letting her gaze travel from the simple gown to Clara's unadorned hair. "You look clean. I suppose the Cavendish fortune can buy good soap." The insult was so blatant, so cruel, that Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to respond, though no words came. But before she could even stammer, Nathaniel's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. "My fiancée's name is Miss Everly," he said, his tone dangerously soft, yet it carried with an authority that made several people nearby fall silent. "And she will soon be the Duchess of Cavendish. You will address her with the respect that title commands, or you will not address her at all." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sheer cold fury in his eyes was enough. Beatrice paled, her poisonous smile faltering, and she retreated without another word. Clara was stunned into silence. She stared up at him, at his hard, aristocratic profile. The defense had not been for her, she knew. It had not been born of affection or kindness. It was pride. He was defending the name, the title, the honor of Cavendish. An insult to her was an insult to him, and to the legacy he was now forced to protect. Yet, it was a defense nonetheless. For the first time, someone had stood up for her in this glittering, cruel world. The feeling was so foreign, so unexpected, that it left her breathless. Nathaniel, for his part, was intensely annoyed at himself. He felt a strange, unwelcome surge of protectiveness, an instinct he had not anticipated. He was merely protecting his own interests, he told himself sternly. He was protecting the name. That was all. Later that week, unable to sleep, his mind a turbulent storm of resentment and confusion, Nathaniel wandered through the silent manor. He found himself drawn to the library, the heart of his father's world. He expected to find it empty, a tomb of memories. Instead, he found Clara. A single lamp cast a warm golden glow on the desk where she sat, not reading, but meticulously organizing the late Duke's voluminous correspondence. She was not merely sorting it, he saw, as he drew closer. She was creating a detailed catalogue, her handwriting neat and precise on index cards. She handled the brittle papers with a gentle reverence that both irritated and intrigued him. He leaned against a bookshelf, crossing his arms. "Such dedication," he remarked, his voice laced with cynicism. "Are you cataloguing his assets, or merely polishing your own halo?" She looked up, and there was no defensiveness in her eyes, only a clear, direct honesty. "Neither," she said simply. "Your father was a brilliant man. His thoughts, his discoveries, his correspondence with the greatest minds of his generation, They deserve to be preserved, not left to rot in dusty boxes. She gestured to a stack of letters. He was a passionate astronomer. Did you know he secretly funded 2 different scientific societies, and that his calculations on stellar parallax were published anonymously by the Royal Society? He didn't want the credit. He only wanted the knowledge to be shared. She spoke of a man Nathaniel had never known. His father had been a distant, demanding figure, his passions seemingly limited to lineage and duty. He had never spoken of the stars, only of the estate. As Clara spoke, she revealed a side of his father that was vibrant, intellectual, and deeply engaged with the world in a way Nathaniel had never imagined. He saw for the first time that her connection to the Duke was not that of a simple, fawning employee. It was a meeting of minds, a genuine intellectual and emotional peerage. This new knowledge didn't fit his narrative of her as a scheming nobody, and the dissonance was unsettling. It planted the first tiny seed of doubt in the barren ground of his certainty. As his gaze drifted across the desk, he noticed a small, leather-bound journal. Separate from the piles of letters she was organizing, its cover worn smooth with use. She had been looking at it before he entered, and he wondered what secrets it held. The wedding, when it happened, was a swift, private affair, conducted in the estate's small, cold chapel, with only Mr. Abernathy and a visibly uncomfortable Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, as witnesses. Clara, now officially the Duchess of Cavendish, felt the weight of the title settle not as a crown, but as a yoke. The simple sapphire ring on her finger was a constant, cool reminder of the impossible bargain she had struck. Yet, as she walked back into the main hall of Cavendish Manor, a strange sense of purpose began to bloom in the desolate landscape of her heart. This was not just a house, it was a legacy, and she was its sworn protector. She began her new role not by issuing commands, but by observing. The staff, fiercely loyal to the old Duke but deeply wary of her sudden elevation, watched her every move. They expected airs, demands, the arrogance of an upstart. Instead, they saw the new Duchess rise at dawn with the maids, her hands, though soft, learning the rhythm of the household. She learned their names, their duties, the stories of their families. She discovered that the account books, which Lord Harrington had overseen with a proprietary air for years, were in a state of complete disarray. More than disarray, they were a work of fiction. She saw exorbitant prices paid to specific merchants, invoices for goods that never seemed to arrive, and a steady, consistent drain on the estate's coffers that pointed directly, if circumstantially, toward the Duke's sneering cousin. Mrs. Gable, a stern woman whose face seemed carved from granite, decided to test the new Duchess. One morning, she presented Clara with a complex staffing issue, a feud between 2 senior footmen that threatened to disrupt the entire household. She laid out the problem with a certain grim satisfaction, clearly expecting the former governess to flounder. Clara listened patiently, her gaze calm and thoughtful. She did not offer an immediate, authoritarian solution. Instead, she spoke to each man separately, not as a judge, but as a confidant, her quiet wisdom untangling the knots of pride and misunderstanding. She proposed a solution that was not about punishment, but about restoring balance, a subtle shift in duties that preserved the dignity of both men while ending their conflict. Mrs. Gable was taken aback, her stern facade cracking just enough to reveal a grudging respect. From a distance, leaning in the shadow of a doorway, Nathaniel observed it all. He had expected her to be a helpless pawn, a decorative figurehead for his new, constrained life. Instead, he saw a woman of quiet competence and surprising strength. He watched her move through the manor not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker, her touch gentle but firm, bringing a sense of order and fairness to a household that had been slowly succumbing to neglect and corruption. His perception of her, the carefully constructed image of a meek, manipulative schemer, was beginning to crack at the foundations. That night, the image of Clara in the library, her face illuminated by the single lamp, her hands moving with such reverence over his father's papers, haunted him. He was drawn back there, to the scene of his first, grudging admission that there was more to her than he had assumed. The small, leather-bound journal he had seen on the desk was now gone, presumably put away for safekeeping. A sudden, fierce curiosity seized him. He went to his father's study, the room he had avoided since his return, and began to search. He found it tucked away in a locked drawer of the main desk, a drawer he knew his father had kept for his most private effects. He settled into the large leather chair that still held the faint scent of his father and, with a sense of trepidation, began to read. He expected to find the ramblings of a failing mind, evidence of the senility Harrington had claimed, proof of Clara's insidious manipulation. Instead, the journal revealed a mind as sharp and lucid as a winter star. It was a chronicle of profound loneliness, of a man trapped in a failing body, his spirit still soaring. He wrote of his disappointment in Nathaniel's hedonistic life in London, but the words were laced not with anger, but with a deep, aching self-blame. He saw himself as the architect of his son's flight, his own coldness and exacting standards, the stones that had built the wall between them. And then he began to write of Clara. The entries were a revelation, a testament to a relationship Nathaniel had never conceived of. A voice that sounded like his father's, yet softer and more vulnerable than he had ever heard it in life, echoed in his mind as he read the elegant script. Clara sees the world not for what it is, but for what it could be. She has a mind that challenges my own, and a loyalty I thought long dead in this world. She is not merely a governess, she is the anchor in my storm. When she speaks of the stars, it is as if she has walked among them. I fear for her when I am gone. Harrington circles like a vulture, and I know he has been stealing from us for years. The ledgers are a mess of his greed. I do not have the strength left to fight him, to endure the scandal it would bring upon our name. But I can build a fortress for her, and perhaps, in doing so, give my son one last chance to become the man he was always meant to be. Nathaniel's hands trembled, the journal falling slightly from his grasp. He felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The will was not a punishment. It was not a cruel joke. It was a desperate gambit, a final, brilliant and heartbreaking move in a game he hadn't even known his father was playing. The anger that had been his constant companion since his return began to curdle, morphing into a confusing, painful wave of understanding and regret. His father hadn't been trying to chain him. He had been trying to save him. The confrontation, when it came, was not at the manor, but in the full, glorious light of a high society garden party. Lord Harrington, furious at having his access to the estate's funds summarily cut off by the new, quietly efficient Duchess, decided to escalate his campaign of whispers into a full, frontal assault. He cornered a group of influential gossips, his voice carrying on the warm afternoon air. "One must wonder," he said, his tone rich with malicious insinuation, "what special services the former governess provided the late Duke to warrant such a very generous inheritance. She spent many a late night in his private study, I'm told. A very dedicated employee." The crowd tittered, a cruel, appreciative sound. The scandal, now spoken aloud, hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Nathaniel, who had been speaking with an elderly baron nearby, turned slowly. He saw Clara standing alone for a moment, her face pale, her eyes wide with hurt as the poisoned words reached her. A cold, white-hot rage, purer and more potent than any anger he had ever felt, surged through him. He walked toward Harrington, his movements unnervingly calm. He stopped directly in front of his cousin, his voice dangerously soft. "Harrington," he said, the name a curse on his tongue, "you are speaking of my wife, the Duchess of Cavendish." He paused, letting the title sink in, letting the crowd lean closer. "The only thing she provided my father was companionship and intellectual debate, two things you are utterly incapable of providing anyone." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Harrington's. "The late nights you speak of were spent cataloguing the library you neglected, and more to the point, balancing the books you plundered." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Harrington's face went from smug to ashen in a heartbeat. Nathaniel's defense was fierce, absolute, and devastatingly specific. He wasn't just defending the Duchess, he was defending Clara. He was using the knowledge he had gleaned from her own quiet actions and from his father's secret journal. Clara, who had come to stand beside him, he looked up at her husband with undisguised shock, and beneath it, a flicker of gratitude so profound it felt like a physical warmth spreading through her chest. This was a turning point, a seismic shift. Nathaniel had acted not just out of pride for his name, but out of a genuine, nascent sense of justice for her. The line between his interest and her honor had begun to irrevocably blur. That evening, The heir in the estate office was still charged from the public confrontation. For the first time, Nathaniel and Clara sat down at the great desk, not as adversaries bound by a contract, but as allies forged in the crucible of a shared threat. The lamp cast long shadows across the room as Clara opened the ledgers, her slender finger tracing the lines of suspicious figures. She pointed out the clear evidence of Harrington's embezzlement, the inflated invoices from merchants Nathaniel now knew to be his cousin's cronies, the ghost payments for phantom repairs. The numbers on the page were a cold, hard confirmation of what the Duke had written in his journal. They quickly realized the scope of the theft was massive, far greater than they had imagined. Over the years, Harrington had siphoned off a fortune, enough to have nearly bankrupted the estate, a fact the Duke had clearly tried to hide. They were caught in a terrible bind. To expose Harrington would be to drag the Cavendish name through a scandalous public trial, confirming the family's decay for all the world to see. But to let him get away with it would be a gross injustice to the memory of the man who had sacrificed his peace to contain the damage. The redemption of the family name, a phrase that had once seemed like a hollow piece of rhetoric from the will, now had a clear and urgent meaning. "Your father knew," Clara said, her voice soft with a dawning comprehension. "He just didn't know how to stop him without ruining the family name in the process. He was trying to protect the legacy." Nathaniel looked from the damning figures in the ledger to her earnest, intelligent face, illuminated in the warm lamplight. A profound realization settled over him. "He wasn't protecting the legacy," he said slowly, the truth of it solidifying as he spoke. "He was entrusting it to you." He met her gaze, and for the first time there was no wall between them, only a shared understanding. "And, it seems, to me." He looked back at the books, a new determination hardening his features. "We need to find definitive proof, something that will force him out without a public trial." Their new alliance, forged in the heat of public confrontation and solidified over the cold, hard facts of the ledgers, transformed the atmosphere of Cavendish Manor. The great house, which had felt like a gilded cage, became the headquarters of a secret, systematic investigation. They became a team, their days consumed by the hunt for the one piece of evidence that would damn Harrington without destroying the family name. Clara, with her intimate knowledge of the late Duke's habits and his labyrinthine filing system, became the architect of their search. She knew where he had kept his private papers, the false-bottomed drawers, the cleverly concealed safes behind seemingly innocent portraits. She guided them through dusty attics, her memory a map of the old man's mind. "He once mentioned he kept his most important thoughts near his oldest friends," she mused one afternoon, leading Nathaniel not to a desk, but to a forgotten corner of the library, where a row of first edition philosophy texts stood, their spines untouched for decades. They found nothing but bookworms, but the process itself, the shared purpose, drew them closer. Nathaniel, for his part, used the connections he had cultivated during his years of hedonism in London. The dissolute lords and cynical merchants he had once called friends were now unwitting sources of information. He would return to the manor late at night, smelling of city smoke and brandy, and meet Clara in the office. Over a single candle, its flame dancing in the dark, he would recount his findings, the whispers he had overheard in gambling dens, the nervous denials of the merchants Harrington had used. They would pore over maps of London, marking the locations of the businesses, their heads bent close together, the shared warmth of the candlelight, a small, intimate circle in the vast sleeping house. In these long hours, their conversations began to drift from the investigation to more personal shores. He learned that she was an orphan, left on the steps of a parish church as an infant. She had been raised and educated by a kind, elderly vicar who had seen the spark of a brilliant mind in the quiet, serious child, and had given her the run of his extensive library. He believed knowledge was the only true inheritance, she told him one evening, her voice soft with memory. He said it was the one thing no one could ever take from you. Nathaniel, who had been given everything and valued nothing, felt a pang of something that felt dangerously like admiration. In return, she learned about the crushing weight of his own inheritance. He spoke of a childhood spent not in play, but in lessons on estate management, of a father who was more a tutor than a parent. He described a cold, lonely upbringing where every achievement was met, not with praise, but with a simple nod and a new, higher expectation. "I was not a son," he said, his voice laced with an old, familiar bitterness. "I was the next Duke of Cavendish, a role I was being groomed for, a part I was expected to play. One particularly cold evening, returning from a long day visiting tenant farms on the far edge of the estate, a chill had set deep into their bones. The carriage ride back was long, the darkness outside absolute. Shivering slightly in her thin cloak, Clara tried to hide it, but Nathaniel noticed. Without a word, he took the heavy woolen blanket from his own lap and draped it around her shoulders, his fingers brushing her neck. The simple, unexpected gesture sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the wool. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the gloom, and he simply held her gaze, the rhythm of the carriage wheels the only sound between them. They rode the rest of the way in a profound silence. The shared blanket, a silent testament to a new, unspoken intimacy. Harrington, feeling the invisible net tightening around him, grew desperate. His access to funds was gone. His cronies in London were growing nervous under Nathaniel's discreet inquiries, and he could feel his power, once so absolute, slipping through his fingers. He decided on a new, more vicious attack. He could not challenge Nathaniel directly, but he could destroy his wife. A new rumor began to circulate through the drawing rooms and clubs of London, a whisper far more poisonous than the last. The new Duchess, it was said, was not content with half a fortune. She was slowly, methodically poisoning her husband, a pinch of arsenic in his wine here, a drop of nightshade in his tea there, just enough to mimic a slow decline and leave her in sole, undisputed control of the Cavendish legacy. The gossip spread like wildfire, fanned by the schadenfreude of a society that had never accepted the governess in their midst. The test of this new poison came at the Royal Opera House. During the first intermission, as Nathaniel and Clara stood in the crush of the grand foyer, they were approached by the powerful and notoriously sharp-tongued Countess of Danbury. She tapped Nathaniel's arm with her fan, her eyes glittering with malicious curiosity. "Lord Cavendish," she said, her voice carrying to the surrounding groups. "You are looking a little pale this evening. Are you feeling quite well?" The implication was clear. The entire foyer seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion. Clara's hand, resting on Nathaniel's arm, tightened. She could feel the tension coiling in him, the familiar anger. But instead of exploding, Nathaniel did something entirely unexpected. He laughed. It was not a bitter or cynical sound, but a rich, genuine laugh of pure amusement that turned every head in their direction. He smiled down at the Countess, a charming, roguish smile that reminded everyone why he had once been the most sought after bachelor in London. "Feeling well, my dear Countess?" he boomed, his voice full of life. "I have never felt better. It seems marriage agrees with me." He then turned to Clara, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "My wife's only poison," he declared, his voice ringing with theatrical sincerity, "is her wit and her intelligence, which I find are a rather effective antidote to the tediousness of London society." He then took Clara's hand, the one that was not resting on his arm, turned it over, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a dramatic, deliberate flourish. "In fact," he added, his gaze holding hers, "I find myself quite addicted to it." The act was a masterful performance, a public relations coup that instantly defanged the rumor and turned the gossip-mongers into objects of ridicule. But as he held her hand, his lips warm against her skin, it felt like something more. A jolt, powerful and undeniable, shot through both of them. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird. In that moment, she saw not the bitter lord, not the reluctant husband, but a charming, devastatingly attractive and powerful man who was, by some miracle, her husband. And Nathaniel, looking down at her flushed face and startled, luminous eyes, felt a surge of raw, unapologetic possessiveness that had absolutely nothing to do with the title or the family name. It was for her, only for her. The clue that finally broke the case came not from a ledger or a London informant, but from the Duke's journal. Reading a passage for the 10th time, Clara's eyes snagged on a cryptic phrase Nathaniel had dismissed as sentimental nonsense. His father, writing about his own mortality, had penned, "When my own winter comes, I shall leave the proof of my life's accounts where all life begins." Nathaniel had assumed it was a metaphor for death and rebirth. Clara, however, remembered the Duke's other great passion, second only to astronomy, botany. The late Duke's private greenhouse, a beautiful glass structure tucked away behind the formal gardens, had been his sanctuary, a place where he coaxed fragile exotic life from tiny seeds. "Where life begins," she whispered, her eyes lighting up with sudden certainty. She led Nathaniel there, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawns. The greenhouse was warm and humid, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, jasmine, and orchids. It was a quiet, peaceful place, a world away from the intrigue and whispers of the manor. Following a sudden instinct, Clara ran her hand along the rough stone foundation on the north side, the side that received the first morning light. Her fingers found it, a single stone, slightly loose in its mortar. With Nathaniel's help they worked it free. Behind it, nestled in a small, dry cavity, was a tin box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the Duke's secret ledger. It was all there. Every fraudulent transaction, every inflated invoice, every kickback from Harrington's cronies, all meticulously detailed in the Duke's neat, precise hand, complete with dates, amounts, and scathing personal notes. It was the undeniable, irrefutable proof they had been searching for. They stood in the quiet, sun-dappled greenhouse, the scent of flowers and victory thick in the air. The victory felt intensely personal, a shared triumph that belonged to them alone. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Her face was smudged with dirt from the foundation stone. A stray leaf was caught in her hair, and her eyes were shining with a fierce, intelligent light. In that moment, the last vestiges of the professional distance between them, the last pretense of their marriage of convenience, evaporated completely. He reached out, his hand moving with a will of its own, and gently, so gently, brushed the smudge of dirt from her cheek. His thumb lingered on her soft skin. Their eyes locked. The air, already thick with the scent of life, grew heavy, crackling with an unspoken emotion that had been building for weeks. He leaned in slowly, his gaze dropping to her lips, giving her every possible chance to pull away. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The scene held, suspended in time, a perfect, breathless moment of anticipation, just as their lips were about to meet. The almost kiss hung between them, a silent, shimmering thing, more potent than any actual touch. They retreated from the greenhouse in a state of flustered, charged silence, the ledger box clutched in Nathaniel's hand forgotten for the moment. They ended up in the library, the scene of so many of their late night strategy sessions, but the room felt different now, the air thick with a new and nervous energy. To break the unbearable tension, Nathaniel went to the decanter of brandy, his movements stiff, and poured them both a generous measure. He handed one to Clara, their fingers brushing, sending another jolt of electricity through the air. He took a large swallow of his own brandy, the fiery liquid doing little to calm the storm inside him. He looked at Clara, who stood watching him, her own glass untouched, her eyes full of a question she did not dare to ask. And he knew he could not go on like this, hiding behind the walls of bitterness and pride he had so carefully constructed. They had to come down. He finally opened up, the words spilling out of him in a raw, honest torrent. He spoke of the immense, suffocating pressure of being the heir, the constant feeling that his father saw him only as a successor, a link in a chain, not as a person, not as a son. He confessed that his wild, reckless behavior in London, the gambling, the drinking, the string of meaningless affairs, had been a desperate, childish cry for attention, a way to escape a destiny he felt he had not chosen and did not want. "I ran away because I was afraid," he admitted, his voice raw with a vulnerability he had never shown another living soul. "I was afraid I would never be the man he wanted me to be. I thought he hated me for it. I thought this marriage was his final, perfect punishment." He looked down into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. But reading his journal, seeing what he was fighting, what he was hiding to protect the family name, to protect me, I see he was just as lost as I was. Clara set her glass down and stepped closer. Her voice, when she spoke, was as soft and gentle as a prayer. "He loved you, Nathaniel," she said, her hand coming to rest on his arm. "He spoke of you constantly. He was so proud of your mind, even when he despaired of your choices." She gave him a small, sad smile. "He kept every letter you ever wrote him, even the angry ones, especially the angry ones. They're in a box in his wardrobe. He He just didn't know how to say it, how to bridge the gap. Her words were not pity, they were not absolution, they were simple, profound understanding. And in that moment, he finally saw her, truly saw her, not as a governess, or a duchess, or a pawn in his father's game, but as the one person in the world who truly understood the complex, painful legacy of the man they had both, in their own ways, loved. The emotional intimacy that bloomed between them in that quiet moment was far more profound, far more earth-shattering than the physical intimacy they had almost shared in the greenhouse. It was the closing of a circle, the healing of a wound, the true beginning of everything. Lord Harrington knew he was cornered. The whispers in London had turned against him, Nathaniel's cold, public denunciation having painted him not as a wronged aristocrat, but as a boorish bully. His access to the Cavendish coffers had been severed completely, the accounts now under the watchful, intelligent eyes of the new Duchess. His cronies were growing distant, their own reputations suddenly more valuable than their loyalty to him. He was a man adrift, his rage and entitlement curdling into a thick, potent desperation. An animal caught in a trap will chew off its own leg to escape, and Harrington was ready to do far worse. He saw Clara as the source of all his problems, the quiet grey mouse who had somehow stolen his birthright. If she were gone, he reasoned with the twisted logic of the truly desperate, everything might change. Chaos was a tool, and he intended to wield it. He arranged a meeting on a desolate stretch of road miles from the estate, the location itself a promise of sordid business. The man who met him there was a local ruffian, a hulking brute with empty eyes and a reputation for violence that could be bought for a handful of sovereigns. Harrington, disdaining to even look the man in the eye, laid out his plan in cold, clipped tones. The new Duchess was fond of visiting the village of Oak Hollow, delivering books to the children and medicines to the elderly. She would be traveling that way tomorrow. The man's job was simple, to sabotage the axle of her carriage, to ensure it would break on the winding, treacherous part of the road that skirted the old quarry. An accident, a tragic, unfortunate accident. He pressed a heavy purse into the ruffian's hand. "I want her injured," Harrington hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "Incapacitated. Create enough chaos, enough confusion, and you will be well rewarded. No one must ever connect it to me." The ruffian grunted his assent, the clink of coins his only reply, and melted back into the twilight shadows, leaving Harrington alone with the sudden, chilling finality of his actions. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Clara, feeling a renewed sense of purpose after the emotional breakthrough with Nathaniel, set out for Oak Hollow with a light heart. Her arm was still healing, but she felt stronger than she had in months. The world seemed painted in brighter colors. As her carriage rattled along the country road, she looked out at the rolling green hills and felt a sense of peace. The creak of the wheels, the gentle sway of the carriage, the warm sun on her face, it was all part of a life she was beginning to believe she could actually live, and live happily. She thought of Nathaniel, of the raw vulnerability in his eyes when he had spoken of his father, and a tender smile touched her lips. Then, the world fractured. There was a sudden, violent lurch, a horrifying screech of tortured metal, followed by the sharp, splintering crack of wood. The carriage pitched forward violently, the terrified screams of the horses a shrill counterpoint to the groan of the breaking axle. For a heart-stopping second, Clara was suspended, weightless, before the carriage tipped and the world turned into a dizzying, chaotic tumble of green and blue. She was thrown from the tumbling wreck, her head striking the hard, unforgiving ground. Pain sharp and blinding exploded behind her eyes, and then there was only a dim, swimming darkness as the sounds of the crash faded into a dull, distant roar. Through the fog of pain, she was vaguely aware of a figure looming over her, the brutish face of the carriage driver's new, temporary assistant, the man hired just for the day. But before he could take another step, another figure appeared, a whirlwind of motion and fury. It was Nathaniel. He had been uneasy all morning, a strange, protective anxiety humming beneath his skin. He had told himself it was foolishness, but the feeling persisted, a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He had followed her, keeping his horse at a discreet distance, feeling like a fool, until he saw the carriage lurch and begin its terrible, final tumble. The sight had frozen his blood. Now, all that cold fear was transformed into white, hot rage. He launched himself at the ruffian, his fists flying, a guttural roar of pure fury tearing from his throat. The fight was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The ruffian, stunned by the sudden appearance of the enraged Duke, scrambled away and fled into the woods like the coward he was. Nathaniel did not give him a second glance. He rushed to Clara's side, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. All the pride, all the cynical detachment, all the carefully constructed walls around his heart had been shattered into a million pieces the moment he saw the carriage fall. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid of how badly she was hurt. He gently, so gently, brushed the hair from her face. Her skin was cold, her face deathly pale. "Clara," he whispered, his voice choked with a fear so profound it stole his breath. "Clara, look at me. Please open your eyes. Stay with me, I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered. Through a swimming haze of pain, she saw his face, his beautiful, aristocratic face, contorted with a desperate anguish she had never seen there before. His stormy blue eyes were filled with a terrifying vulnerability. He was no longer the scorned heir or the proud duke. He was just a man, terrified of losing the woman he... The thought trailed off, lost in the encroaching darkness. Her lips moved, forming the words, her voice a faint, weak whisper that he had to lean close to hear. "Nathaniel," she breathed, a faint, wondrous smile touching her lips. "You came." His presence, his terror for her, was the last thing she knew before the darkness claimed her completely. The following days passed in a blur of quiet anxiety. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, her head throbbing from a severe concussion, her arm, broken in the fall, tightly bound in a sling. The world was a muffled place of hushed voices, soft footsteps, and the gentle pressure of a cool cloth on her forehead. Whenever she surfaced from the fog, he was there. Nathaniel had not left her side. He had carried her back to the manor himself, his face a grim, white mask. He had dismissed the fussing maids, insisting on seeing to her care personally, watching over her with a fierce, unwavering devotion that silenced the entire household. He sat in a large armchair dragged to her bedside, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching her, his expression a mixture of fear, regret, and a tenderness so profound it was heartbreaking to behold. One afternoon, she woke to find the room filled with the warm golden light of the setting Sunday. The house was quiet. She felt clear, headed for the first time since the crash. She turned her head and saw him, asleep in the chair. His head was slumped to one side, his dark hair falling across his forehead. His proud, handsome face was softened in sleep, etched with exhaustion. One of his hands rested on the edge of her bed, his long fingers curled just inches from her own. Her heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming wave of love. She stirred, a small, involuntary movement, and he woke with a start, his eyes instantly finding hers, wide and alert. The dam of their unspoken emotions, held back for so long by pride and misunderstanding, finally broke. He leaned forward, taking her hand in both of his touch infinitely gentle. "Clara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I was such a fool, a proud, blind, arrogant fool." He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "When I saw that carriage fall, the thought of a world without you in it, it was not just unbearable, it was nothing, a void. I realized in that single terrible moment that this marriage, this obligation, it has become the only thing in my life that feels real, the only thing that matters." He brought her hand to his lips, his voice dropping to a raw, trembling whisper. "This started as a duty to my name, Clara. But it's not about the name anymore. It has not been for a long time. It's about you. It is only, and has only ever been, about you. I love you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling over and tracing warm paths down her temples. His words were the confession her heart had been longing to hear, a truth she had felt in his actions, but had not dared to hope for. "And I love you, Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice catching on a sob of pure, unadulterated joy. "I think I have from the moment you defended my honor at the ball, even when I knew you were only defending your own. You were magnificent." It was a moment of pure, unvarnished truth, a perfect joining of two souls who had been set on a collision course by a dead man's will. All the pain, all the misunderstanding, All the loneliness of their pasts was washed away in the quiet sanctity of that sick room, their mutual confession, a vow far more sacred than the one they had spoken in the cold chapel. They were no longer two separate people bound by a contract, but a single, unbreakable unit, bound by a love that had been forged in adversity and tempered in fire. A few days later, with Clara recovering but her mind as sharp as ever, they sat together in the study. The secret ledger lay open on the desk between them. With their newfound emotional clarity, they looked at the familiar pages with new eyes. It was Clara who saw it first. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she traced a line of figures with her finger. "That's odd," she murmured. The estate's income from the northern farms was down by half that year, a terrible harvest. Yet the overall accounts for the quarter were only slightly diminished. How is that possible? Together, they began to dig deeper, referencing the secret ledger with the official doctored account books. And then they saw it, the final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle. The Duke had not only been meticulously tracking Harrington's theft, he had been systematically replacing the stolen funds with his own personal money. He had sold off priceless works of art, rare books, even his mother's jewelry, all to keep the estate solvent, to pour money back into the coffers that his own cousin was draining. He was slowly, deliberately bankrupting himself to hide his family's shame, to protect the Cavendish name from the scandal that would have destroyed it. The will, they finally understood, was his last, desperate resort. He knew he was dying. He knew the estate was on the brink of collapse. He knew Clara's integrity and her sharp financial acumen could restore it. And he had hoped, with the fierce, desperate hope of a loving father, that the forced marriage, the shared responsibility, would finally make Nathaniel grow up, take his place, and become the man he was meant to be. The redemption his father had written of was not just about exposing a thief. It was about Nathaniel learning the true meaning of sacrifice and duty from his father's final, silent, and devastatingly costly act of love. Nathaniel stared at the ledger, at the proof of his father's quiet, agonizing sacrifice, and a profound, overwhelming wave of love and regret washed over him. He finally understood the full, crushing weight of the burden his father had carried, and carried alone. He had seen his father as a cold, demanding patriarch, but in reality, he had been a warrior, fighting a silent, lonely battle to save his family and his son. Nathaniel gently closed the ledger, his hand resting on the worn leather cover. He looked at Clara, his eyes full of a new, quiet strength. He finally understood. His father's greatest act of love was not a pronouncement or an embrace. It was this complex, painful, and ultimately successful plan to save them all. The summons went out that very afternoon. Nathaniel, now fully inhabiting the authority of his title, requested the presence of the key members of the Cavendish family in the Grand Library at 4 o'clock. The air in Cavendish Manor grew thick with an electric tension, the staff moving with a hushed, nervous energy. Lord Harrington arrived first, followed closely by his sister, Lady Beatrice. Harrington strode into the library with a defiant arrogance, his face a mask of contemptuous indifference. He believed this was a final, desperate bluff, a pathetic attempt to intimidate him with no real proof. He saw the new Duke and his governess, bride as amateurs, children playing at power. He was wrong. Nathaniel and Clara stood together before the great fireplace, a united and formidable front. They were not seated, but stood as if holding court, a subtle but powerful statement of their new reality. Clara's arm was still nestled in an elegant silk sling, a visible, damning reminder of Harrington's depravity. Yet, there was no trace of the victim in her posture. A new confidence radiated from her, a quiet strength that was more commanding than any title. She was no longer the invisible governess hiding in the corners of the room. She was the Duchess of Cavendish, standing resolute by her husband's side, her gaze clear and unwavering. Beatrice, taking in the scene, the grim set of Nathaniel's jaw and the unexpected steel in Clara's eyes, felt the first, unwelcome prickle of fear. Her brother's smug confidence suddenly seemed brittle, foolish. Nathaniel let the silence stretch, allowing the tension to build until it was a palpable thing. When he finally spoke, his voice was not raised in anger. It was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion, which made his words all the more devastating. He began to lay out the case against Harrington, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. He presented the findings from the late Duke's secret ledger, his voice a steady monotone as he detailed the years of systematic theft, the specific, fraudulent transactions, the network of shell companies and complicit merchants. Harrington began to laugh, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "A fantasy," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "The pathetic ramblings of a dying, senile man. You have no proof that will hold up in any court. It is my word against that of a madman and a manipulative chit." "You're right," Nathaniel agreed, his voice dangerously soft. "I have no intention of taking this to court. A public scandal would tarnish the name my father died to protect." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the pale, shocked faces of his assembled relatives before landing back on Harrington. "However," he continued, reaching into his coat and producing a sheaf of papers, "I have here signed and witnessed affidavits from 3 merchants in London, men you know well. When faced with the evidence of their own complicity and the choice between a prison sentence or leniency, they found their consciences with remarkable speed. They detail your instructions, your threats, and your methods in exquisite detail." The color drained from Harrington's face. This was the checkmate. This was the move he had never anticipated. But Nathaniel was not finished. He took a step forward. "They also testify that you approached them for another task, a more recent one, to hire a man, a certain ruffian, to arrange an accident for my wife's carriage." The final blow landed with the force of a physical strike. A collective gasp filled the room. Lady Beatrice stared at her brother, her face a mask of pure horror, the full depth of his depravity finally revealed. Harrington's carefully constructed facade of arrogance dissolved completely, crumbling into a pathetic, sputtering fear. He was no longer a lord, he was just a common criminal, exposed and trapped. Nathaniel delivered his terms with the cold precision of a surgeon. Harrington would, this very hour, sign a full confession, detailing his embezzlement and the attempted murder of the Duchess. He would immediately sign over what remained of his own personal fortune as partial repayment of the stolen funds, and he would remove himself to the continent by week's end, never to return to England, never to use the Cavendish name again. The alternative was simple. If he refused, or if he ever set foot on English soil again, the full weight of the evidence, including the affidavits and his confession, would be turned over to the authorities. Ruin or exile. There was no other choice. "My father's final act was one of sacrifice," Nathaniel said, his voice resonating with a new, profound authority that was entirely his own. "He sacrificed his own fortune and his peace of mind to protect the honor of this family from your greed. My first act as Duke will be to restore it." He looked at his cousin with a final, chilling dismissal. "You are a disgrace, Harrington, but the name will endure. Now sign the papers and get out of my house." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Harrington stumbled to the desk. With a trembling hand, he signed the confession, his signature a spidery, illegible scrawl. He did not look at anyone as he pushed himself away from the desk and walked, a stooped and suddenly old man, out of the library and out of their lives forever. In the silence that followed, the remaining family members, humbled and ashamed, turned their gazes to Nathaniel and Clara. There were no more whispers, no more sneers. There was only a dawning, grudging respect. They were, at last, the undisputed Duke and Duchess of Cavendish. Months later, as autumn painted the estate in hues of gold and crimson, they stood once more in the small private chapel. This time, there were no cold vows spoken under duress. The chapel, once a place of frigid obligation, was now filled with sunlight and the warm, sweet scent of jasmine and roses, all brought from the greenhouse where their love had so nearly blossomed. It was a small, intimate gathering, with only their most trusted staff and a few genuinely loyal friends in attendance. Clara wore a beautiful, elegant gown of ivory silk, simple and unadorned, save for the small, secret sapphire on the ring that graced her finger. As she walked toward him, Nathaniel looked at her not with resentment or suspicion, but with an adoration so pure and profound it lit his entire being. This was not a marriage of convenience. It was a celebration of love, a renewal of vows not as strangers bound by a will, but as partners who had fought for their future and won. They faced each other before the altar, their hands clasped, their eyes locked. Nathaniel spoke first, his voice clear and strong, ringing with a truth that came from the very depths of his soul. "I once saw you as a chain, "A burden I was forced to carry," he said, his gaze full of wonder and love. "But I now know you are my freedom. You are my conscience, my heart, and my home. You taught me the meaning of loyalty, sacrifice, and love. I love you, Clara, my Duchess." Clara's eyes shone with happy tears as she smiled up at him. "I once saw you as a duty, a cross I had to bear to honor a good man's memory," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But I now know you are my destiny. You are my protector, my partner, and my greatest love. You saw the woman behind the governess, and you fought for her. I love you, Nathaniel, my Duke." They sealed their new vows with a kiss not of obligation or tentative hope, but of passionate certainty, a promise of a lifetime of shared sunrises and quiet evenings, of partnership and unwavering love. A year later, the gardens of Cavendish Manor were flourishing. Under the joint stewardship of the Duke and Duchess, the estate was thriving as it had not in decades. The tenant farms were productive, the staff was happy, and the Cavendish name, once on the verge of ruin and scandal, was now more respected than ever, associated not with idle aristocracy, but with integrity, innovation, and good stewardship. The final scene of their turbulent story unfolded on a warm summer afternoon. Clara and Nathaniel walked through the rose garden, hand in hand, their earlier tension replaced by an easy, comfortable intimacy. Clara held a letter in her free hand, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. It was from the Royal Society for the Advancement of Science, thanking the anonymous Duke and Duchess of Cavendish for their second generous donation, a gift that would fully fund a new observatory. They were continuing the late Duke's secret passion, honoring his true legacy not of title or land, but of knowledge and progress. They were happy. The ghosts of the past, of bitterness and misunderstanding, had been laid to rest. They had redeemed the family name not by hiding from its flaws or burying its secrets, but by building a new legacy, one founded on love, honor, and a true partnership. The quiet governess, who was meant to be a pawn, had become a queen, not of society, but of her own life and of the heart of the man beside her. And the scorned heir, who was meant to be a puppet, had become a true and noble leader, a man worthy of his father's sacrifice. Together, they had fulfilled the old Duke's last, desperate, and brilliant wish. They paused at the edge of the garden, looking out over the rolling green lands of their home. Their faces turned toward a bright and promising future, a future they had built together.